In Photoshop class, we have decided to go through the recommended workflow from start to finish. The workflow is a checklist. It's always image dependent. You may not have to do every step on your image. A lot of times, if we're doing primarily global adjustments, we know that we can create 85 to 100% of most of the work that we need to do in our raw processing tool, like ACR or Lightroom. It's not always necessary to go into Photoshop. But when we're producing a print, or we want to do some specific editing or retouching, or we're working on a scanned image or a JPEG image, then generally working in Photoshop is helpful. So this kind of assumes that you're working on any kind of file, which is why it's really a checklist. The first step is always to evaluate your output device. Decide if you're making a print, if you're going to display on a monitor, if you are going to make an image for the web, because we have to work backwards, because knowing what kind of output our final image will be displayed on informs our decision-making process along the way. So that's number one, okay? The next step is to open the image in Bridge or Lightroom and to embed our metadata. That's not really listed here, but that's really important. Opening our picture and assigning keywords so that we have a nice database as our image library grows is more important than we think, because a couple months from now, it's easy to accumulate hundreds of extra images, and if you decide you want to do something with them, you need to be able to know how to locate them and where to find them and to stay organized. A useful website to stay informed is dpbestflow.org. That's DP, like digital photography, best, B-E-S-T, flow, F-L-O-W.org, and that's linked off of my blog at ericagentry.com. It has a lot of good updates on metadata and keywording, as well as some workflow kind of solutions, and down to things like file structure and backing up. It's a really good resource. So we're going to go ahead and start with number 2. We're going to assume that we're going to print onto an inkjet paper, an inkjet premium photographic paper like Epson Premium Luster or Semi-Gloss. That's going to be our target, and we're going to print to one of the newer Epson or Canon or HP printers. So I'm going to browse in Bridge for my image. You can do the keywording while you're in Bridge. I like to use Lightroom for the database and the keywording, but occasionally when I'm looking, I do use Bridge when I'm just looking for that one picture that I want to bring into Photoshop, and I don't want to have to open a bunch of catalogs to look for it. So the machine's running a little slow tonight, but let me just scroll through the images here and see. I set something up for you guys. Here's a bunch of samples in the samples folder, which is great. That's in the pictures folder. That's the default, is for Bridge to look in the pictures folder, and I actually want to look into the workflow folder on the desktop that we set up. So I have 2 images here. I have a TIFF. This is a scan from a color negative. It's upside down because many times when we have scans made, they aren't delivered the right orientation. If I was working on the scan, I would open it directly into Photoshop, and I would skip over working on it in ACR. I would still use Bridge or Lightroom to keyword, though. So I might definitely enter in at least my copyright information. Option G on the keyboard is your copyright. And then probably some keywords too, but I'm not going to do that right now. And the same for this image. This is an image taken from the Martin Evening archives. So we would enter in our keywords and our copyright information. And then I would choose to open it in Camera Raw or in Lightroom. You can open several images at once into Camera Raw. This is a Camera Raw file, which is why I'm opening it in Camera Raw. The TIFF that you saw, the scan TIFF, I would skip processing it in Camera Raw. There's no reason to. Unless you want to use the tools available in Camera Raw, you can open that directly in Lightroom. In Photoshop, rather than go through a Camera Raw processor. But a RAW file requires us to demosaic the information in a Camera Raw processor. So some of the things that we definitely want to do is remember that it's set up to work from left to right and top to bottom. Here I can do some white balance adjustments. I can work with the histogram and do a little bit of exposure adjustments. I know that I'm going to take this image into Photoshop and play with it. So my approach is going to be different than if I wasn't going into Photoshop. So I tend to do a lighter set of adjustments in Camera Raw or in Lightroom when I know I'm going to also go into Photoshop. And there are some presets here from the last time that I worked on this file. If you double click on these little buttons, they go back to how the image was captured, or the engineers set up some presets for us, and this is the default. So the default is to correct for brightness and contrast that lacks in Camera Raw files. So I might choose to increase the exposure even a little bit more, especially in the midtones here. A little bit more brightness. I do like the curve in Camera Raw. This is set to medium contrast, which is where we left off with this image. But I know I'm going to be working with it again in Photoshop, so I may not completely correct for the white point and black point all the way. I might choose to wait and do that in Photoshop. But I'm definitely going to take advantage of some of the sharpening options in Camera Raw because they're specific to Camera Raw images. Okay? Just want to see what this looks like. And also some of the exposure, the clarity, the vibrance, the saturation, those are very specific to Camera Raw files. I'm sorry? I'm not sure if the guy is waving. I think he looks busy. We can zoom in and see. I don't see if he's waving or not. Okay. So go through the Camera Raw and decide workflow and decide what it is you want to correct. Things that you should definitely be looking at are exposure, sharpness, and perhaps a little bit of saturation. Because again, these tools are specific for Camera Raw files. They specifically demosaic Camera Raw files. Of course, you can also use them on TIFFs or JPEGs. But I would start here if you're working with a Camera Raw image and work your way through to the left, the right-hand side. Again, I'm not going to go overboard because I am going to open up this picture in Photoshop and work on it a little bit there. Very important, probably the most important setting if you plan to go into Photoshop after Camera Raw or Lightroom is this option here, to click here. We've made the decision to work in ProPhoto RGB. That's the largest color space. I like to work in ProPhoto RGB because you can soft proof and turn on and off your paper profiles as you're working. So even though it's a large color space, you can soft proof along the way to see how you're doing. Some people prefer to work in this color space because it's a little bit more realistic in compatibility to prints. I like to keep it here. 16 bits per channel, take advantage of that if you've captured in RAW or if you've done a large scan. And then always work in the native file size. Most service bureaus prefer that they do the interpolation if they're going to increase the size of your file for print, so it's best to keep it in the native file size. The lowest resolution for an inkjet print that's recommended is 240. You can print with resolutions lower than that, but for now I'm going to go ahead and leave it in 240. I'm not going to sharpen it yet because we're going to work in Photoshop. And I'm going to open it as a smart object. So I'm going to say open the object. And the smart object is helpful for a number of different reasons, but in this case, a smart object means that I can double click on the image in the layer and return to the ACR processor if I need to, if I want to do a little bit more correction or reduce some of the correction that I made. We also know that smart objects are good in general for layers that are going to be sized in a collage to keep the resolution, and for using smart filters, which are editable. But in this case, with a raw file, it's important to choose the smart object off the bat when you're importing into Photoshop instead of later, so that if we want to go back and make adjustments, all we need to do is double click and it takes us back to the raw processor. We can make a change, say OK, and it updates in the layer stack, the smart object. So that's the reason for smart object. Okay? Next on our list after is step 3. Step 3 is going to be to go through and look for any retouching that's needed on a separate retouching layer. The retouching tools in Lightroom and in ACR aren't that great. So if you know you're going into Photoshop, you might as well save up your retouching for Photoshop. And we do that by making a blank layer. So we're going to make a new adjustment layer, or rather a new blank layer. And we're going to name it Retouching. And it's going to sit here on top of the background layer. It's going to sit here on top of the background layer so that as we add layers on top of it, it's included. And we'll just zoom in and we'll do a little bit of retouching. As a review, we like to retouch with either the healing brush tool or the clone stamp, depending on what we're doing. The healing brush tool sources texture and blends it into color areas. The rubber stamp tool takes exact pixel information and moves it from one place to another. I like to have it set on current and below. And we're going to option click in a good area and then cover up the area that we want to cover up. All right, so what are we looking for? We're looking for dust or abnormalities on the image that are maybe undesirable. But camera dust, which particularly shows up in the red, green, or blue areas of your image, such as clear blue sky. This could be a place if you were working on a portrait to get rid of skin areas that are undesirable and that kind of thing, okay? I don't really see a lot here, but I just wanted to include that for demonstration. So you can see that I'm retouching on a blank layer instead of duplicating the background layer to save file size, and that's why we have this set on current and below. So far we've evaluated our image, we've opened it in ACR, and we've retouched it on a retouching layer. The next thing you want to do is save this as your new original, as the image that you can come back to if you want to, in case it goes a little too far. This is rather optional. If you do everything as a layer, then it's non-destructive. But once you start getting into combining layers for sharpening, then it becomes a destructive workflow. So I'm going to save this as Ice Colors 1. You can save as a TIFF with layers. TIFF is a non-proprietary open source format, so technically it's the most archival. Or you can save it as a Photoshop file, which is going to be a little bit smaller in file size. I wanted to point out that if you're working on a very large file, there's a rather new Photoshop format called the large document format .psb. And this is designed to more quickly save and open large files. So maybe anything over a couple hundred megabytes. This PSB format is good for. After we do this, we've saved. We're going to use levels or curves to set the white point or black point to make global tonal adjustments. So at this point, we're setting a white point and black point first. And the reason we're doing that is because tone affects color. So we want to work with the tonalities of the image first. we'll go ahead and call up levels. And leave that there for just a minute. And you can do this manually, or we can do the technique that we learned in class with the threshold adjustment. All right, so I went ahead and called up the threshold adjustment. And I'm going to choose my color sampler tool. And the first thing that we're going to do is find our brightest, or rather our darkest image area, which is here, and I'm going to plot the darkest image area. Okay? Next, we're going to find the lightest image part of the image, which is here, and I'm going to plot that point. When you're done plotting your highlights and your shadows, you can throw away the threshold adjustment. And let's take a look at those. So our darkest image area is anywhere between 18 and 25. And our lightest image area, it looks like I plotted 2 points accidentally. I'm going to get rid of one. And our lightest image area is anywhere from 235 to 245. So we need to decide, based on our substrate, where we want our black points and white points to fall. This is not a specular highlight, so I don't want a pure 255. Let's say a 245. That'll show us some nice subtle detail without getting too white. In the dark area, do we want to map it to pure black? Let's zoom in. There's a little bit of detail here, but 10 is pretty dark. 10, anything from 0 to 5 is no detail. 5 to 10 might have a little detail. I'm going to vote to leave the shadows at 10, just to see what it looks like. But the best thing to do is to print out a gray step wedge along with your CTI target on the paper and printer that you're doing the black and white targets for to find your desired black and white point, because this is going to shift. We know that watercolor paper is more absorbent, for example, so we may want to increase the black point on watercolor paper. So back to the levels, I'm going to go ahead and click on the black, double click on the black eyedropper to set the black point, and this gets kind of sticky. Sometimes it doesn't want to set. Let's do white first. 245 we said for the highlight. Some instructions, you'll see they tell you to set the brightness instead, because it's one stroke. It's a little bit easier. Yeah, we'll save that. And then the black point, we said we're going to increase to 10. So 5 is a little deep, but 10 is looking pretty good. Yes. So I'm going to go ahead and set the black point first. I'm going to click once. If you accidentally click in the wrong place, edit, undo. Instead of just clicking multiple times, do edit, undo, and click again. And then we'll scroll to the white point, which is here, and I'm going to zoom in, and I'll set the white point also. Click once. So you didn't see a huge movement. Notice that my blacks remapped to 10 and my whites did get a little brighter at 245. If we turn it off and on, you can see that. Last but not least is the neutral point. You can set the white balance in ACR, and then you can also further work with it if you want to in the levels or curves adjustment. And there's many ways to set the neutral point. I prefer to do it on another layer because that's color balancing. It's not tonal adjustments. Okay, so we're just going to put this on hold for now. So these are my density, or these are my tonal adjustments. And if you want the tonal adjustments not to affect your saturation, right? Here I turn this on and off. There's a little bit of brightness and highlights, and the image has gotten a little less blue in the shadow areas. Then I would set this to a luminosity. Notice how it no longer affects the color shift like it did in normal mode. In normal mode, it affected the color a bit. In luminosity mode, it's only affecting the tonal pieces, the black and the white. Okay? So I set the black and white points according to the substrate or the output. The next thing I'm going to do is use curves to do further color corrections. And we learned a lot about curves the last couple weeks, that there's different ways you can use curves. I'll go ahead and make a curve here. And I want to also bring out my info. So if I roll around on my info, with my info palette on the image, by the way, I'm at a 3x3 average, which is great for 11x14s or smaller. Anything larger in terms of print, you may want to work with a larger average. And we see that this image has what kind of shift? Consistently. Blue, yes. Consistent blue shift, which is probably the color that it was. There's no gray card in this image, so we don't really know because there's no gray card to click on or see what the colors actually were. But this kind of weather and this kind of environment is pretty blue. We could neutralize with the neutral eyedropper by clicking on an area that we think is neutral in real life, and that's what we get. But that doesn't seem very realistic. You could also click up in the clouds. That's a little bit more realistic. It's realistic if your monitor is calibrated. And then we could go through with a calibrated monitor and make adjustments based on what we think it should look like. If we wanted to put the blue back a little bit, we could. So, you know, the color correction part is very subjective unless you're working on a product. Generally, products have a very specific color rendition that needs to get followed, in which case you would absolutely include a Macbeth color checker chart or some kind of a gray card. Landscapes are a little more open to suggest, you know, interpretation. So I can interpret this image a little bit warmer if I wanted to, or a little bit bluer if I wanted to. Did you guys like the blue look more? You like this look a little bit more? A little too much? How about there? Okay. We'll stick with that. We'll do our hard, and remember we can do a soft proof under custom to see how we're doing. And I have the Epson Premium Luster profile loaded. So we'll take a look at that. And I'll say preview, say okay. And it's on. I don't want to work with it on, but I can turn it on and off with the Command Y option. And I don't see a huge shift. This is a paper with a lot of latitude that generally interprets the image quite well straight out of the gate. If we wanted to see what it looked like just for fun with a funkier paper or more of a watercolor paper like Epson Velvet Fine Art Matte, you have to memorize these things. They're crazy. Or something nuts like the Hahnemühle Canvas Artist. Well, we should see a difference with the Canvas Artist. Let's see. Command Y. Not really. They're on. It's on. Command Y, so there's on and then off. Okay, you see a little bit of change in the blacks. You see how this profile opened up the blacks? It's very slight, but you can see it, okay? So it's a good idea to do soft proofing along the way. And normally we would also do a hard proof at a smaller size just to check and evaluate. And it's not uncommon for a lot of photographers to do as many as 3 or more prints and with corrections in between. So we would use further color adjustments if needed. Some of the color adjustments that we looked at include the selective color. Where is it? Selective color adjustment. We also looked at hue, saturation, brightness adjustment. I don't recommend you ever use color balance ever again. Promise you won't. You should be using curves instead, okay? Thank you. Maybe it'd be fun to look at some hue saturation adjustment. So I'm going to name this. I'm going to name this plus warm. And this is going to be my hue saturation adjustment here. And with hue saturation, again, you definitely want a soft proof because a big mistake with photographers is that they oversaturate. Why? Because we like it. It's pretty. But not all papers can handle this kind of saturation, and it looks rather unnatural. So let's say I just want to work with the blue tones. I can go in to the blue channel, select the TAT tool, click on a blue area, and just increase the saturation a little bit in the blues. Likewise, if we wanted to affect just the reds, I could click on just the reds here and maybe desaturate the reds a little bit. It's up to you. Evaluate the image. You decide if it needs it. This just happens to be the point in our workflow when we would go ahead and make those adjustments. Selective editing, when does that happen? Selective editing can happen now. It just depends if it's tonal adjustments or color adjustments. I like to kind of keep them grouped. So if I wanted to make another tonal adjustment that was selective, first I would select the area. Let's say I want to darken the sky a bit. I'm going to select the area. Then I'm going to add a curve. Okay. And I'm going to name it Darken Sky. And I can go ahead and, delete. Work with the targeted adjustment tool to darken the sky a bit. Okay. And make sure also then to double click on this area and feather that mask so that you get a nice smooth transition. And then if you don't want it to affect the color, just the tone, I would switch it to a luminosity mode. That's up to you. And then I could group these to organize them a little bit better, and they could be called tonal adjustments, global and local. All right, so now I have all my tonal adjustments in one place. And I could say that these are going to be my color adjustments. Okay, and likewise, if you had any local color adjustments, now would be the time to do that. So if we wanted to draw a path around the boat and warm it up a little bit, we could do that. Next on our list is to burn and dodge if needed, and also sharpen. Burning and dodging and sharpening, there are a lot of different ways to do this. We know we can use curves, and there's another technique which is nice that happens at the end of your workflow just to kind of tweak things a little bit, and that is using blending modes. It's the burn and dodge technique. Using blending modes, the soft light or the overlay mode. I like the soft light. It's a little more subtle. So we want to make sure that black and white is our default. I'm working in the brush, B for brush. I'm enlarging the brush, increasing the opacity, and I can go in and paint a little bit, literally paint with black. I'm going to show you what it looks like. That's not really showing up very obvious. You can see it happening slowly. Okay, if I wanted to add a vignette, voila. Not too crazy about that, but it gives you an idea. If I turn this layer off and turn this back to normal, yes, we are actually painting with black on the image. It's just that in an overlay mode or a soft light mode, it makes it appear as if we're darkening or lightening the image. And you know what? I don't like that big move I did. So I'm going to go ahead and erase part of it. Just like that. Only maybe with a softer brush. I'd probably decrease the hardness on that eraser and clean it up a bit. So this burning and dodging is nice because you can use the paintbrush. The burning and dodging and tools over here are destructive. I don't recommend using them for this application, but there's some other great applications for the burning and dodging tool. Next on our workflow would be to do other effects if needed. So any other special repairs, any skin softening, any kinds of vignetting or edges if you wanted to add edges. Those are some things we're going to go over. This is when that would happen. Next, we want to save the image. I want to save this because this is my large layered original. Then I want to resize my image. So I need to decide what my print size is going to be. Let's go ahead and resize it as an 8 by 10 or an 8 by 12 in this case. And I'm going to throw away some of my resolution because I don't need it all. 360 is the largest resolution needed for an inkjet printer, so you don't need to keep more than that. I'm going to say OK. And since I'm printing to an inkjet printer, I can set the borders in that dialog box. But if I wasn't going to an inkjet printer, if I was going to a service bureau, some service bureaus, depending on how professional they are, allow you to request the borders, and the customer service person will ensure that the borders get added. But some more automated service bureaus, like a Costco, may not do that for you. So in this case, I might upgrade my image size to an 11 by 14 and add some borders around the edges. There's another video on YouTube that just goes over doing that. But after this saves, after it downsizes, we're going to go up to image and then canvas size, and I'm going to increase the borders around the image to fit on like an 11 by 14 sheet of paper. And I want to make sure that white is my background color when I do that, or that I select it as my background color when I do that. If you go like this, it goes much quicker. Haha, April Fools. Okay? So that's taking some time. So why don't we pretend that we sized it, all right? And we're going to go straight up to canvas size. This would say 8 by 12. And I'm going to go ahead and add a couple inches around the sides and canvas size. You can also just choose relative, which allows you to just simply add the inches on and not all the way around and not have to worry about the final size, okay? So I could do that. It's a good idea to at least have a 1/4 inch border on all of your work for handling purposes and for framing purposes. I don't believe in borderless pictures unless you're putting them into a plastic sleeve or some kind of a book that has that particular style. If there's going to be any handling of your images at all, passing them around outside of a book, taking them out of a box, or any possibility that you're going to frame them, you should add at least a 1/4 inch border. Okay? So we will have added the canvas size, which puts a 1/4 inch all the way around. This is a large file and I'm having trouble. In Photoshop, there's something called performance. And the more hard drives you click on, the faster it'll run. You see how I didn't have my largest hard drive checked? And I'm going to increase Photoshop size. So let's see if that helps it run a little bit better or faster. You really want to give Photoshop as much hard drive space as you have available, including whatever is plugged in to your computer, such as your external. All right? And while that's working, it'd be nice to be able to look at the other pieces on the, so we'll just look here. So we went ahead and we're sizing the image now to our output size. Next, we're going to sharpen it. Sharpening the image requires thinking backwards and knowing your substrate. For example, a watercolor or a smooth fine art paper might require more sharpening than a glossy style paper, okay? So let's take a look at that, and it's still going. We're going to pretend we did, all right? So to sharpen, we want to combine all the layers together. So I selected all the layers by clicking on the bottom layer and shift-clicking on the top layer. That might not be necessary, but I like to select the layers. I'm going to hold down my Option key, and I'm going to choose Merge Visible. So what it's going to do is it's going to take a copy of all the layers, and instead of merging them into one and flattening, it's going to merge them into an additional layer on the top of my layer stack. So when you hold down the Option key, it does that. And that's going to be the image that I want to sharpen. When I sharpen the image, it's going to be done on a smart filter, because it's a smart object. So we can use smart filters if we turn it into a smart object. There are a lot of different ways to sharpen an image. You can combine your favorite techniques. You can use more than one technique. It really just depends on the paper you're going to, the style that you like, and also the subject matter. I should have used a smaller file in demonstration because this is a problem. When you watch the Adobe tutorials, they always use a small file because it goes a lot faster. This is 130 megabytes, which isn't really that big, but for our little machines it is. Hurry, 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 hurry. Which, by the way, if you want to see more of these tutorials, you can visit the website and link on tutorials. And they'll come up, and I post mine from class as well as other ones that I think are interesting. Okay? You can also click on the YouTube station, and that'll take you directly to all of the tutorials that I've done personally, both in Lightroom and in Photoshop. All right, now we're done, and we say we have a merged layer. We see we have a merged layer here. We're going to call this Sharpen. And it is not a smart object, so I'm going to go ahead and convert it to a smart object so that I can use smart filtering. And you could apply a sharpen, unsharp mask. We'll look at them. A smart sharpen, if you like that, underneath the filter options here, and those will be editable. I also like what's called high pass sharpening, which is kind of an alternative, which entails putting a high pass filter on the image to find the edges, and then putting a blending mode layer of soft light on that. So basically, it increases the contrast of the edges, it turns them black and white, and then we put it in soft light mode. So here are the different sharpening options. Smart sharpen and unsharp mask are the two most common. And we do that on a smart object. It allows us to change our mind later. Okay. A big mistake is that a lot of image makers over-sharpen. Sharpening is not the same as sharpening through the lens or making sure your image is sharp. It increases the edge contrast of the image. So you actually want to be careful. Also, we're sharpening square pixels so that when they get outputted to dots, it's going to look even sharper, in my opinion. So I like to sharpen until it looks good on screen and then reduce that by 10 or 20%, personally. So I'll say OK. This is something to consider. You may not need to sharpen the image. If it's really grainy, it's not going to help. Adding more grain to kind of control the structure might be a better solution. If you've sharpened it a lot in ACR, this is what's called output sharpening, sharpening for the substrate, okay? And I can double click on the smart filter icon right here to go back and change my mind. This is why smart objects are so nice, is that it allows for non-destructive editing, okay? And it also gives me a mask, so that if I decide I don't want the water, I want the water or the person's skin and the sky to remain smooth, I can mask that out of the smart filter, and that's really cool. I was in the eraser tool. I want to be in the brush tool. And you see that should be turning black any minute, showing us our mask. Okay? So the other option I was telling you about is the high pass option. And another reason why we combine layers for sharpening is in case you have anything that's been retouched or collaged. So it makes a nice flat image. So I'm going to go ahead and throw away this smart filter. And I'm going to instead choose filter, other, high pass. And the high pass works. It's a little strange because people say, well, how much am I supposed to do it? Well, how much should the radius be? Well, anything between 0.5 and 1. And the goal is just to see the embossed edge of your picture. Because what we're doing is we're adding contrast to the edges of the picture. So you just want it to be very subtle. And then you're going to put this in a soft light mode, which increases the contrast of the edges, or burns and dodge basically. Burns and dodges the edges. It's in the same, okay, we need to rasterize, that's fine. Let's turn it on and off. Can you see a difference? Very, very slight. And it's kind of slow because the machine's being a little slow. If you want a funny, kind of a grisly technique on portraits, an interesting thing to do is to duplicate this layer many, many times, and you'll get that kind of weathered textured look on portraits, which can be an interesting effect in itself. So you can duplicate this layer to make the image even extra sharp. So that's workflow start to finish. Remember that this is a checklist. The last thing we would do was output to our printer using our proper profile attachment. If we were going to a inkjet printer, we would let Photoshop manage the colors and apply our profile within the printer dialog box. We don't have an Epson printer hooked up here. If we were going to deliver to a service bureau, we would go ahead and convert to the proper profile, save as a JPEG. Saving in a JPEG at 100% is the same quality basically as a TIFF. It's just that it's 8 bits instead of 16. The other thing is if you save a JPEG at 80%, it cuts the file size in half, and I have done some tests. I see very little difference in sharpness or quality. So if you're delivering a file over the web, sometimes saving it at 80% can take a lot less time, but you'll have to run your own tests, okay? And then we would save it as a JPEG, okay? And we could embed the color profile, although it's not necessary because we've already converted it. And then when we upload the file, you want to make sure to turn all auto adjustments off if you are printing to type C at a service bureau. Okay, so I hope that is a helpful little reminder of how to work with this recommended workflow that we're doing in class. There's a lot of different journeys to one destination. These are just my recommendations. Let me know if you need any help.